Well, good morning. Welcome to Grover Hill Zion United Methodist Church here at 204 South Harrison Street here in Grover Hill. We're glad you're viewing with us this morning. And of course, you're always welcome to come and join us in the sanctuary for worship and fellowship on Sunday mornings at 10:30. This is the 16th Sunday in our 16th Sunday after Pentecost. And so for this Sunday, we're speaking from the prophet Joel chapter 2 and from Ezra chapter 3. And I've titled this Vision, Sharing Our God-Given Vision. Boy, you know, this is a time of uncertain times, isn't it? Almost like it was 20 years ago. Not quite as bad, it doesn't seem like. Still, though, we don't know, do we? Some uncertain times, but God has promised to be with us even through difficult times and difficult circumstances. 20 years ago, 9/11 happened. Remember that the Twin Towers, that two passenger planes were flown into them, and over 3,000 people were killed that day. And then there was a plane hit the Pentagon, and then another plane, the terrorists were overcome by the passengers, and it crashed into Pennsylvania. Tragic time. Everyone knew that we were going to war. We didn't know what the outcome was going to be. Now they brought this 20-year war to an end. Not in a good manner, you might say, but I don't want to get into the politics of it, but we still have Americans left behind. So today, I guess what I'm trying to say is we're still in some uncertain times. 20 years ago, after 9/11, people began going to the churches, seeking guidance and hope in uncertain times, and how to live in those times and how to come through those times, and to pay homage to Almighty God as well. Today, in our difficult times, many have turned away from the church, and they've forgotten about God. And it's always been that way, even clear back in Ezra's day or the prophet Joel's day. People would turn away from God when everything was going good. If they were on cloud nine, they didn't need God. Everything was going too good, so they rejected God, and they turned away from God. And that's the way it is today. We think that everything's going well for us, and so many of us don't think that we need God. The truth of the matter is that what we have in this world is only temporary. No matter how much we try to accumulate, it's only temporary. Well, there is a lot of concerns about what is happening in our nation right now. Seems like the disbelievers or the unbelievers that are running this country today, and it seems like they led us down a path of perversion. One lie after another after another. You don't know what to believe or who to believe anymore. We're told that our God is truth. God is truth. So if we trust and believe in Him, we will know the truth. A fellow by the name of Erwin Lutzer, a number of years back, wrote a book called What Happens When a Nation Forgets God? What happens when a nation forgets God? All we have to do is look around our nation today, and we can see that, can't we? The believers seem to be pretty much at peace, but the unbelievers are running everything, and they're wrecking everything. They don't call themselves unbelievers. They say they're woke. They're woke. Woke to what? But anyway, I don't want to get into that either. It's like we've forgotten, though, about God and what we stand for as a nation. In his book, John Collins wrote a book that was perhaps the #1 book for businesses and organizations a few years back, and it's still a very excellent book today. It's called From Good to Great. Good to Great. And so I'm going to share some stories from his book today, in this message today. First is a story of the buggy whip industry. Now, it's long failed. It's pretty much gone away, except for just a few remaining clients, like in the Pennsylvania Dutch areas and over here in the Bern areas, and the Amish area where they still use a horse and buggy. Well, despite, though, our belief that the automobile made the buggy whip obsolete, Luther says, or Collins says, that's just simply not true. The industry failed making buggy whips because they actually believed that they were in the buggy whip making business. That's not very clear, is it? They were making buggy whips, so most of us would say they were in the buggy whip making business. But Collins says, let's look at it this way. They were so involved in worrying about their product or worrying about their existence that they forgot to focus on the industry, or they forgot to focus on the service that was the very reason that they existed. They failed to clearly define the service their product provided to their client base. Without with the product moving off the shelf rapidly every day, it was difficult for them to see the end of the need for that their product was coming to. They confused product and product sales with market and market potential. And it's like throwing a rock up in the air. And everything's just fine as long as that rock continues to ascend. But when it hits its peak, what happens to it? It doesn't stay on top very long, does it? When it hits its peak, it begins to descend rather rapidly. It's like up to the very last minute, when as long as you're going up, you look pretty good until you start coming down again, and then you hit bottom, don't you? You hit the ground. Well, what service did the buggy whip industry provide when the automobiles were still in the minds of visionaries? Everybody who had to go somewhere within a certain radius took a carriage or a coach or a buggy. And in front of those carts was a horse. And you had to have something to make the horse go. Thus, the buggy whip. So you could say that the buggy whip was a starting device. These new automobiles, in order to make them go, in order to start the engine, had cranks on the front of them. Every automobile had this crank that had to be used on the front of the car in order to start that engine. So you could say that that crank was a starting mechanism. The cranks were often lost or broken, and they needed to be replaced. Thus, the first replacement auto part. So isn't it logical then that rather than disappear as the need for the existing product declined, the buggy whip companies could convert from a buggy part company to an auto part company. They could make starters, but they didn't. They just kept making buggy whips until nobody bought them anymore. And so they were stuck with a lot of inventory of buggy whips that nobody was using. So the buggy whip industry disappeared not because cars made their product obsolete, but because they forgot the service that their product provided was ignition. As the product needs of the client change, you change your product or your service, or you go the way of the buggy whip. Is this a unique instance of self-obsolescence? Or no? You know, a lot of companies are faced with that problem. The railroad business, for instance, when I was a young person, I'd sit out on the front steps or on the front porch with my grandfather, and we'd watch the trains go up and down the track. They had 2 tracks there in Van Wert, plus they had a train depot and all that. Busy. Trains were going east and west all the time. And yet, the railroad passenger business almost completely disappeared in the country as they competed with the airline industry in the 50s and 60s due to the fact that they forgot that they were transportation companies that happened to own trains. They could have just as easily become transportation companies that own trains and planes. The steamship industry as well waited 20 years to shift their focus from transportation of travelers to the partying of vacationers. A shift in the end product that saved the industry that had been in distress since the late 1950s. Every organization needs to look at its product or its service offerings periodically to ensure that it is making the needed changes in those products. We need to also make sure that our services are relevant as we help the mission of building our client base. It's very difficult to do that when everything is going well, that we continue to keep growing and growing and growing. We become blinded in the industry or become blinded in the organization. And we don't think about the changes that are needed or the requirements of the conditions that are needed to help the client base or to help build the congregational base. Well, it's not quite as busy now, we say, as it was 6 months ago, and that gives the recruiting industry an opportunity then to review the mission part, the service part, and the practices and the client costs, and to see if we are truly relevant or if we're just a buggy whip market, or if we're a buggy whip seeking a market, I guess I should say. The Israelites were in captivity in Babylon. Some 40 years earlier, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroyed the temple as he conquered Jerusalem. He burned its gates, leaving nothing but a pile of rubble. It was the common practice to tear down a conquered people's temple, so as to just erase or eradicate any hope that they might have of returning. Have you ever seen someone without hope? It's a pathetic sight. But our God is a God of hope, because his home is not of this earth. When folks lose hope, it makes it more easy to control them as well. People realized that they could never restore the city or the temple by themselves, that they needed divine intervention to help them if they were ever going to build the temple again or the city. Before healing or restoration in our lives can ever take place, we need to hear, we need to realize the cold, hard truth of our situation. The people cried out to God, and God heard their cries, and he blessed the people as they left Babylon to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild that city and the house of God as well. As God blessed the people, that would seem to be an impossible dream became a reality as the temple rose up out of the ashes. That which was broken and destroyed was renewed and restored. That which looked to be dead was raised to new life because of God. The people worked on the building, on building the house of God with their whole hearts. It was a beautiful sight to behold. The temple, they say, could be seen, its golden dome glowing in the sun for miles away. As people held the temple, or beheld the temple from the mountaintops, they saw that the God of Israel was indeed an awesome God worthy of praise, as they looked at the wonders that he caused to happen. The people, even though they had been captives in a foreign land and their temple had been destroyed, they never stopped dreaming. They never stopped dreaming of the day when God would restore them to their glory and take away their shame. I say shame because it brought shame upon a people when their God's house was laying in such a horrid condition. Nothing but a pile of rubble and ashes. They prayed, ate the Passover meal, and began working on the temple. Notice they not only prayed to God, but they took action as well. They didn't just pray expecting God to do something. They prayed and then they took action, and God empowered them. Prayer alone will not build a temple or grow a church. Of course, prayer is absolutely essential in the ministry of the church. Prayer without ministry is a powerless ministry. But there is a time to take action when the praying is done. For instance, Joshua, and you can read this in Joshua chapter 7, Joshua kept praying to God about a mistake that he made. He kept praying over and over. And he prayed so long that God finally got tired of hearing him. And he said, "Stop praying about your failure and get up and correct the cause of it. Take action. Take the action that is necessary to make things right." There's a time to pray, and there's also a time to act. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, Solomon writes that there is a season for everything. There's a time to build and a time to throw away. A time to get rid of the old and accept the new. A time to change and a time to go in a different direction. It's hard to embrace the new sometimes, isn't it? It's kind of inconvenient. May not be hard, but it's just sometimes creates a little inconvenience for us, and we don't like that. You know, 30 years ago when I moved into the house where I'm at now, my aunt and uncle had lived there, and it was in need of some repair. In 1969, they had remodeled the house and put a different kitchen in and everything. It was all dark wood. I mean dark wood, really dark, darker than the wood that's here. It was almost black, just dark. And the paint was discolored that was on the walls. Oh, I lived in there for a while, and it just was discouraging to come home and to see that. I like things bright and cheerful. You know, dark colors just kind of or have a negative effect on me. So I had new siding on the outside and new windows installed, and I had a new kitchen put in with light colored cabinets, and I painted the walls white. And for me, now everything is bright and cheerful. It made a big difference. Even though I resisted the change in the beginning, in the end it was worth it all. It was worth it all. Ezra said the foundations of the temple, or Ezra laid the foundations of the temple. And some of the older folks who remembered the first temple began weeping. They wept. And they saw the restoration beginning, while the others rejoiced at seeing their dream beginning to come true. Still, there were enemies who tried to stop the work of rebuilding the city and rebuilding the temple. Ezra answered them saying, "You will not stop us. You have no part of this. We are building this house for the Lord our God." Some folks never wanted to change, but they were content to just leave everything in a big pile of rubble. But God's people would have none of it. They went to work building the house of God that would be no shabby building, and a wonder to behold. Nehemiah as well, in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 17, was tasked with rebuilding the walls and the gates, and he said to the people, "See the trouble we're in? The walls and the gates have been burned and knocked down. Let us rebuild them so we will no longer be in disgrace." So they rebuilt the walls of the city. The temple and the city rose up out of the ashes because the people of God prayed. And God gave them a vision of restoration and empowered them. And the people worked with all of their hearts to build the house of God. What dreams or visions do you have for God's house? Listen, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with others. And when you're dreaming, dream God-sized dreams. Don't think about money as you dream and share your vision. That would come a lot later. Well, in the peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. Have a great week.